Here's brutally honest advice you can use today to win with your military finances. Service members throughout America are notorious for being bad with money, that's a fact. But just because you're in the military does not mean that you're destined to become a financial victim. In reality, the military gives you one of the biggest wealth building advantages in the country. You've got guaranteed income, low living costs, no major expenses, and more time than you realize. And if you use that correctly, you can build wealth faster than almost any civilian your age. My name is Levi Wolf, and today I'm breaking down the exact system that I use, the same system that took me from losing six figures in the market, starting completely from zero, all the way back to a six-figure net worth using safe, cash flowing, and smart assets. In this video, I'm covering the 5 key parts of that system so you can understand why it works and how it applies to your own lives. Thousands of Marines, veterans, and service members are already using this exact strategy, so grab your pen, take notes, and let's get into how to get rich on active duty. Now, before I ever built savings, bought real estate, or set up this entire system, I needed to understand one thing. Most Marines don't struggle with money because of low pay, they struggle because of the structure of their money. And here are the 5 things that trickle into why your savings might not quite be where you'd like them to be. So before we actually fix anything, we need to actually understand the problems. And most Marines think that they have a money spending problem, but the first issue is actually their savings rate, because the average American only saves about 4.4% of their income, which is basically nothing. So if you want to build real wealth, your target shouldn't be 2 or 5%, but more like 10 or 25% of your income. And you need to do that consistently. And why that's hard in the military is because your environment pushes you to spend. You know, everyone's buying cars or taking trips, going on leave, eating out, especially door dashing all their food, or they're just buying things to impress everyone but their own bank account. So even if you want to save more, your surroundings are constantly dragging your savings rate back to the national average. And if the environment wasn't enough, the second problem is inflation, like real inflation. From 2020 to 2025, the dollar lost 25% of its value. Everything around you got significantly more expensive. Like, think about it, the dollar literally lost a quarter of its worth in less than 5 years. And the whole time your expenses went up, your savings probably didn't. Why? Because most Marines don't own assets that grow fast enough to keep up with inflation. So even if you do save, the money you have is quietly losing value every single year. So part of it's not your fault. You're just trying to sprint up a hill that's getting steeper and steeper the longer you run. And on top of that hill of growth, you're gonna find taxes. And Marines don't realize how much this eats away from them. For example, today a certificate deposit might make around 4%, but if you pay 20% in taxes, that means the return is actually closer to about 3%. And a high yield savings account makes about 4%, but you have the same problems. And stocks can grow, but you're hit with income tax if you sell to cash out early, or if you even sell them to go buy other stocks with it. Now, every dollar you earn now gets taxed, and every dollar that you earn later gets taxed again. And the crazy part is that even when you finally save, you usually can't even use that money when life actually hits you. So the question is, where do you keep your emergency fund? Why do you even have an emergency fund? And for most people, the question is really, do you have an emergency fund? Because you probably should. And life gets kind of weird. You know, your car breaks down, you PCS, you go on leave and something goes wrong, you're eventually gonna need cash. And the most common places that people store it usually mess you up. For example, certificates of deposit lock up your money with penalties if you try to use it. The TSP locks your money up with penalties and taxes you if you touch it early, right? And then the stocks, if you have any gains there, they get taxed either the moment you sell, or we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And a regular savings account, as you already know, it gets hit with inflation the hardest every single day. So Marines either lock their money up so tight that they can't touch it, or they keep it somewhere else that makes it inaccessible, or they just watch it lose value. And that's a lose-lose. So now let's quickly touch on the problems of both the spender and the saver. So a spender borrows money for everything. They're constantly in debt. But every time they finish paying something off, for example, like a car, they go and finance another one. So throughout their whole life, they spend so much in interest that leaves them forever when, you know, they pay it and they'll never get back. And it's so much harder to capture anything for savings beyond zero. So take that, that's a spender, versus where we have the saver. And here, at least the saver, his habits, you know, he can save up a bit, maybe, you know, 15, 20, 30,000. But what happens here is that, let's use the same example of the car, he'll go out and he'll go buy a car. Now his savings reset to zero. So once all that money leaves your system, now you lose a potential for compounding to take place, and again, you're back at zero. So whether you're a saver or a spender, if you don't have a real system, then you're gonna get stuck. And that's why most Marines never build wealth, even though the military is one of the easiest places to guarantee it. Because when your savings rate is low, inflation is high, and taxes eat away your gains, and you have limited access to your money, then the system itself is broken. And if your default system is broken, then you just need a new system. And personally, I fixed every single one of these problems for myself because, like most people, I thought about EASing after my first contract. So I went home on leave, built a business plan, which, by the way, I was going to be a personal trainer, and I had a plan to open up my own gym after that, and everything was lining up perfectly. But then the unexpected happened. I did an early re-enlistment, but I was still out in Japan and still wanted to learn stuff. So I studied finance and real estate and life insurance. And after months of studying after the gym or while on duty, what I found unknowingly checked each and every one of these boxes. The biggest thing that I learned during that time was how to use whole life insurance as a financial system, not just an insurance policy. And here's what I learned and why it became the foundation of my savings and eventually worked its way into my real estate investing strategy. The first thing that this solved for me was forced savings. And this is huge, especially in the military where your environment is built around spending. So with whole life, you have premiums, which is like your savings bill for your future self. You set it either monthly or one lump a year, and the rest happens automatically. Primarily, it protects you from your own bad habits because it completely gets rid of the I'll get to later problem where you keep pushing off savings, and it guarantees that future you actually has money when you need it. And real quick, let me give you a real example. So I had a Marine who recently EAS, and while he was on active duty, he had a budget, but he ended up not sticking with it. So now he's a civilian at home and waiting for his first civilian paycheck. He's stressing about money, but then he realized that he had cash value in his policy. So he used that cash to bridge the gap between him EASing and him getting a job, and that was able to hold him over. Because most people want to save money, but their checking account says otherwise, but this forces you to win. If you're worried about EASing and having nothing to float you for a couple months, or if you want a real emergency fund that actually stays saved, then this solves that, especially because of the idea of predictable growth. Because while everything else in the world is swinging up and down, crypto stocks, and even right now the S&P, whole life has guaranteed growth every single year. And personally, all I cared about was just making sure my savings was beating inflation. The most traditional carriers guarantee around 2% APY, and the current dividends are sitting around 6% depending on the company. And these companies have been hitting these numbers over the last 120 years through world wars, recessions, inflation spikes, and they still pay. And when you have a predictable base, every other decision in life gets easier because you have a financial backbone holding you up. So now you have someone holding you up and also pushing you forward because of the tax advantages. And again, growth is nice, but it's not about how much you make, it's about how much of that you can actually keep. And since everything grows with tax advantages, personally, I let my savings marinate here. Then when I go find another good investment, specifically like a real estate deal, I go and I push it there. So overall, it's well-rounded because taxes are a guaranteed expense and reducing them is a guaranteed return. And you may not control the market, but you do control how much your money the government gets to touch. But overall, all this doesn't matter if you don't even have access to money. And one thing that I really liked when I started using the system was how easy it was to access my money when I actually needed it. Because most places make it complicated, not because it's not your money, but because the rules make it tough. For example, we know the TSP has age restriction, and brokerage accounts hit you with taxes the moment you try to sell your stocks. And CDs also lock you in. For example, when I was a Lance Corporal, I maxed out a CD. At the end of the year, I got $75 in interest. I thought that was amazing. So I took that money and I rolled it over into the CD for the next year. And it was a year-long CD, but about 6 months in, an opportunity came up and I wanted to liquidate the account. So I closed the account, but I pretty much lost all the interest that I had in that account because of the fees and penalties and all that. So if a real estate opportunity comes up or a family emergency happened, or you wanted to buy a nice new car, for example, with the policy, you just request a policy loan and the money shows up because it's your savings. And honestly, that's what made it feel more like a real saving system than anything else I was using before, because it's accessible without punishing you for needing it. And beyond savings, whole life makes all of your future investments way more efficient. And that's because of compounding. And this is actually where most Marines lose most through inaction, because compounding is when your money earns money, and then that money starts earning money, and eventually that growth outpaces your contributions. But here's the catch. The key ingredient is time. And if you start compounding a year or two late, you lose the most valuable years with the most benefit on the back end. And that's why even having your savings compounding is a game changer, because just like borrowing against real estate or stocks, you You can also borrow against your policy, but the cash inside keeps compounding at the full value, and that's called uninterrupted compounding. So remember when we had the regular borrower who always paid tons in interest that he'll never get back, and how we had the saver who lost the opportunity cost? Now there's that third option to not interrupt the compound growth. And let me give you a real example. So I had a Marine that was going to buy a $20,000 car, and the bank offered him a 9% interest rate, but at the same time, he had the cash to buy it outright. So option A is he could pay cash, but then lose all the compound interest that his $20,000 could have made, which over, even at a 5 or 6% interest rate over a couple years would be a good amount. Or option B, he could take the bank loan and then pay what would have come out to be about $5,000 in interest that he'll never get back. Or option C, which is a strategy that we use, was to run that $20,000 through a policy first and then borrow against it. And in this example, real life, he paid about $2,600 in interest compared to the $5,000. But at the same time, his policy grew by about $5,500. Meaning that just by doing that, he made nearly $3,000 just by borrowing his own money instead of using the bank. And this might not seem like a lot, right? It's only a $3,000 profit, but over every car you ever buy or every property you ever look at over your entire life, this makes a huge difference for you, for your family, and for everyone. And this also means that you can keep your savings as your savings and keep your investments as your investments. Now, throwback to when I lost 6 figures, unfortunately, it was only after I realized something the wealthy have been doing forever. And it's really important to make that distinction here right now. So the rich never confuse their savings as their investments, ever. And that's where I messed up, and that's what service members are still doing today. They think their savings is their TSP balance, or that their savings is their Robinhood account, or that their savings is their crypto wallet. But here's 2 problems with that absolutely destroys financial stability. Problem number 1 is going to be taxes, because when your savings is actually an investment account, the number you see is not the number you keep. And remember, it's not about how much you make, it's about how much you can actually keep. And short-term capital gains can wipe out 20 to 30% of your profit. So that $20,000 you think you could use in emergency is realistically more like anywhere from $14,000 to $16,000 after taxes, which is a huge difference if you're pulling this money out for an emergency. And problem number 2 is volatility, because if the market dips right when you need money, which you can't control, then you're forced to sell at a loss. And even when the market grows, you're still going to get hit with taxes the moment you touch it. So you're stuck between losing money when the market's down and losing money when the market's up. And that's why confusing savings with investments destroys financial stability. Real quick, before we touch on real estate, I just want to say I'm currently taking on new clients while spots are still available. So if you want to get your savings set up properly with a strong policy and use it to get into real estate like I'm about to show you, click the calendar link below while it's still up. So once you fix that, once you finally have a real savings system that grows predictably, stays accessible, and isn't exposed to the markets, the next logical step is to add a second layer. And for me, the next step was real estate. And I chose real estate because it gives you 3 things all working together at the same time. You have cash flow, appreciation, and tenant paid equity. There's other components to it too, but today we're just gonna be focusing on the big 3 over here. So the first one is gonna be cash flow. Cash flow is simply rent minus expenses, and it's the money left over. And expenses are things like vacancies, repairs, CapEx, and all that goes into putting together a good property. So it does take some active setup in the beginning, finding the right place, buying at the right price, getting the right tenants, but once it's running, the income becomes semi-passive, and it's usually very consistent with very little hiccups. And the best part about cash flow is that it stacks on top of your paycheck. Now, appreciation is a property growing in value over time, and historically that's around 3 to 5% per year. But what's crazy is that you earn appreciation on borrowed money, not just your down payment. So for example, if the house is $300,000 and you put $30,000 down and it grows by 4%, you didn't just earn 4% on what you put in, you earned 4% on the whole $300,000. And that's why real estate compounds so much faster than a savings account, because it's just a larger asset. And there's other things you can do to add to appreciation, like value add, and that just means adding things to the property. But in general, it's pretty passive, just like tenant equity. Because every time your tenant pays rent, they pay down your mortgage, they pay down your debt, and every monthly payment chips away at the loan and increases your equity, meaning more ownership, which means more net worth and more long-term options. And this is what also protects you, because even if your cash flow is small in the beginning, the loan is getting paid down for you. So now that you know how and why to structure your savings and why real estate is also a great growth option, here's how to combine the two to have your savings continuously pump out cash flowing properties by having your savings work in two places at once. Here's an example. For this example, we're gonna be using the VA loan to buy a $250,000 house. And we're also gonna be borrowing $25,000 from our life insurance policy to cover the cost of closing in and everything associated with that. And for both of these, here we have a 15-year mortgage, and we plan on paying that policy loan back in 15 years. And here's how it works. First, we're gonna be looking at our policy loan. So over those 15 years, that are 25 grand at assuming a 5% APY, 5% growth, would over 15 years be $52,000. And at the same time, that same $25,000, assuming we had a 5% interest rate attached to it, it would cost us $10,500, meaning overall at the end of those 15 years, assuming we did nothing, then that policy would have a net gain of $41,500. And for our property, here's how our mortgage would play out. Our property over the same 15 years, $250,000 at 3%, which is gonna be our appreciation, right? 3 to 5%, we'll just say 3%, would mean that our 250 turns into 390 after 15 years. Now imagine that we have a 5% interest rate on the mortgage, which means that over 15 years, we would pay $105,000 on our mortgage. So overall, we take how much the property is worth at the end, and we subtract it by how much the loan costs us, and we have a net gain of $285,000. Pretty simple. So our total real estate profit was $285,000, and with our whole life was an extra $41,500, putting us at $326,500. But with that whole life, remember that $41,000, that's a tax-free difference of 14.5%. So all this is to say is that you have your regular investments and you have your savings. But when you do it the right way and you do it properly like this, now it just goes and it makes all your investments way more efficient. And in the end, you never needed to choose to save or invest, because you can do both with the same dollars. And that's the whole advantage. So if you want to run the numbers yourself or to see if this is even right for you, click the calendar link down below and subscribe for more.